Okay, welcome to this session. My name is Tim Powell-Jackson, and I work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'm chairing this session. So the session today is called New Approaches to HIV Prevention, Protecting Women from Economic Shocks to Fight HIV in Africa. A very warm welcome to this session. We've got a very busy schedule, so I'm not going to spend too long making introductions. So the focus of today's session is on economic shocks and how they can affect HIV outcomes, and particularly looking at how to protect women from these economic shocks and whether that has any consequences for HIV in Africa. So we got four very nice presentations. Each presentation will be 8 minutes long, followed by a 4-minute discussant. And the first paper is a literature review paper by Henry Cust. And then following that, we've got 3 empirical papers, one on drought and HIV by Carol Trebisch, a next paper on COVID and HIV by Wally To, and then finally an empirical paper on Tabaski and HIV, which is a religious festival by Henry Cust. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Henry to start us off. You're very welcome to put questions in chat. Otherwise, you'll be able to ask your questions at the end after the presentations and the discussants have said a few points. So over to you, Henry.
Hi, thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. Moments. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, if you could just make it slide.
Yeah, it's on the wrong
slide.
Sorry, it's on the wrong one. Wait there. PowerPoint problems. No, sorry. There we go. Great. Thank you all for coming. So yeah, this first paper is going to be on a literature review that we undertook, looking at economic shocks and risky sexual behaviours in low and middle income countries. And it's a project with myself and my PhD supervisors. So first of all, HIV in sub-Saharan Africa is disproportionately affecting young women. As you can see on these graphs, the majority of infections between women aged 15 and 24 years old. So why are young women so vulnerable to economic shocks? Well, a lot of it's to do with economic gender inequalities and a lack of safety nets. And one of the ways that they can consumption smooth and deal with economic shocks is through transactional and commercial sex. One way is ex ante, to build safety networks for themselves. And the other is ex post, to receive direct monetary or non-monetary support when a shock occurs. And now there's a distinction between sex work that's quite important. So there's sex work as an occupation, which is an explicit sex for money transaction. And then there's more implicit transactional sex that is very widespread, hard to detect, and also contributes significantly to HIV transmission. So the market for transactional sex, there's a large risk premium that comes with having unprotected sex. And as you can see in the figure, it can be as high as 81% compared to protected sex. And then there's evidence that this premium also exists in more transactional relationships. So there's basically the outcomes that we looked at in this review. There's extensive margin outcomes, which are how many people are engaging in risky commercial or transactional sex. The intensive margin, so how much sex they're providing. And then the riskiness, how risky each sex act is that they are providing. Then we wanted to categorize the economic shocks, and the two main categories that help us understand the effects is expectation. So how long, once someone is affected by a shock, do they think it will last? So we categorize into temporary, those that last no more than a couple of months. Persistent shocks last between 2 months and 3 years. And then permanent shocks are ones that last for much longer, so over 3 years. And then the scale, which is not exactly the magnitude, but it's how many people are affected. So idiosyncratic are individual shocks to individuals or households. Covariate affect wider communities, kind of the village level maybe, and then aggregate are entire economies or regions. So from our systematic review, we from 1,500 titles and abstracts, we ended up including 35 papers in the review. So our key findings, the main one is the heterogeneity of studies. So there was a wealth of different methods used, primarily cross-sectional panel and RCT designs, empirical designs. And then the samples and populations were also incredibly varied. So all but one of the samples included women. And then there was one study that had an only male sample. And most of the mixed sample studies tried to differentiate effects between males and females. So with the shocks, what we found is a lot of studies actually study more than one shock within there, at least more than one category of shock within the study. There were fewer positive shocks, but of these, over 95% were randomized and idiosyncratic, with only one larger scale positive shock. There were more negative shocks, but these were generally quasi-random or non-random, so things like droughts. The positive shocks were mainly cash transfers. So with outcomes, we had a group of studies that looked at health outcomes, which is kind of the realization of the consequences of risky sex. Then we looked at the direct outcomes of risky sex. So we have the extensive margin, intensive, and degree of risk. And as you can see, the majority looked at riskiness outcomes. There weren't many extensive margin outcomes that we could find. And then there was a series of other indirect outcomes, which I won't talk about today. So to summarize the findings, we built these evidence maps. And so each of the symbols represents a study, and a study can appear more than once. We have the expectation of the shock down this column, and then the outcomes categories along the top. Now the colors indicate whether this shock led to increasing risk of HIV. If it's red, if it's green, it's decreasing risk of HIV, and if it's gray, there was conflicting results. The crosses indicate if it was an idiosyncratic shock, squares, covariate, and then circles, aggregate. And then finally, if it's filled in, they found a statistically significant effect, and if it's hollow, they did not. So as you can see, this is for negative shocks. You can see that the idiosyncratic ones across all three direct measures of riskiness, there's strong evidence to show that it's increasing HIV risk. Then in persistent shocks, you see all three categories of shock. So covariate, idiosyncratic, and aggregates, all leading to increasing risk of HIV. Now this green square here was found a protective effect, but this was actually for a male-only sample, which makes sense with our kind of theory and model. So for positive shocks, we did the same. And the first thing you can see, there's more green, there's more protective effects of positive shocks, but these effects are not always statistically significant. In fact, the majority weren't. And also you can see that there's a lot of idiosyncratic shocks here. Now where positive shocks are protective is in this permanent section with a covariate shock, which was a resource boom, and it was quite a significant kind of rapid economic development in Zambia. So our conclusions, first of all, we found a very wide range of literature. There were many outcomes, many shocks, and there wasn't much comparable between studies, which kind of limited our conclusions a little bit. But we did find that persistent negative shocks drive all elements of risky sexual behavior, and in particular, where it was measured, entry into transactional sex markets, which I think is really important. Unprotected sex, so kind of the riskiness elements for consumption smoothing, was far more responsive to negative shocks than it was to positive. And positive shocks have to be very large to see consistent reversals in risky behaviours. And also that the cash transfer evidence was mixed in this review. I finally just want to thank the British Colleges for funding, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Henry. And then we've got a few minutes of discussion from Matt Quaife. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you, Henry. Very clear presentation, and I really enjoyed watching your pre-record as well, which is excellent. So a really nice study. I think you've done a really good job in synthesizing, all these dimensions of heterogeneity that you talked about, of different types of shocks, different periods of time, different ways they impact on people. And I think your the way you've presented results in that grid, it gives you a clear synthesis across those outcomes, which has been really nice. I found it really interesting that the findings were so consistent across all of the different shocks and all of the different settings. And that made me wonder kind of what was going on beneath the surface. There would be an interaction, I guess, between some of these shocks and structural factors about the way different societies are structured, employment or education dynamics and how they relate to economic shocks. But I think you've done such a nice job in synthesizing the dimensions that you've got. It'd be very difficult to go into much more detail around those sorts of things. And I think there's one clear gap that you highlighted briefly in your talk then about the extensive margin. And you said in your pre-record that it's a limitation of, I guess, study design, that we don't know. We know a lot about people who exist in this market and may make decisions within a market or an environment, and may make decisions to increase intensity or reduce intensity of transactional sex, but we know much less about people who drift in and out in between this environment and other work environments or sex work environments. And I think that's a really key area for future study that you've identified. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Matt.
Excellent, thanks, Matt. Let's move on to the second presentation from Carole Trebisch. Over to you, Carole.
Thanks. So I'm very happy to present you today a joint research with Eleanor Bell, Aurélia Lépine, and Elodie Blanc that explores the effect of agricultural shocks on transactional sex among young women in Malawi. So in 2018, more than 1 million people in sub-Saharan Africa became infected with HIV, and women are disproportionately affected. So reducing the prevalence of HIV, but also of other STIs has a potential for large societal benefits. In addition, an important gender inequality in terms of work opportunities is observed in those regions and leading to a higher vulnerability of women to extreme poverty. As a matter of fact, female extreme poverty and risky sexual behaviors are interrelated, and transactional or commercial sex are among the key behavioral practices associated with risky sexual behavior. Engaging in such activities may be explained by poverty and absence of work opportunities, but they can also be explained by income volatility, as they may allow women to cope with negative income shocks in the absence of formal or informal coping mechanisms. Interestingly, income volatility, as opposed to income level, has only been examined recently as a driver of HIV. In the context of climate change, the frequency and severity of extreme weather events in sub-Saharan Africa is growing. The impact of extreme weather events on HIV infection may threaten the efforts to control the HIV epidemic. So this article studies the effect of unanticipated economic shock on sexual behaviors of young women and men. We explore if weather shocks are linked with STI and HIV through an increase in transactional sex. To do so, we take advantage of DHS data collected during an harsh drought, only affecting certain areas of Malawi. And in this DHS wave, transactional sex questions were asked for the first time. All this enables us to directly investigate the transactional sex channel going from droughts to HIV. In order to study the relationship between droughts and drought-related economic shocks and HIV prevalence, we consider the decomposition presented by Burke and co-authors. More precisely, HIV prevalence is impacted by drought through a change in income that modify the sexual risk taken by individuals and can translate into engaging in transactional sex, for instance, that subsequently is likely to influence the HIV prevalence. From this theoretical framework, we derive hypotheses to be tested with our data. First, we expect that women employed in agriculture increase their supply of transactional sex in areas affected by droughts. Second, we anticipate that men employed outside agriculture increase also their consumption of transactional sex in areas affected by droughts as their relative revenues get larger. Finally, these changes on the transactional sex market can lead to a rise of STI and HIV prevalence in drought-affected areas. The Malawi context is a quite interesting setting to study this relationship between drought, transactional sex, and HIV. Indeed, HIV prevalence in the country is around 10% in 2016. Transactional sex practices have been documented in the country, and major droughts due to El Niño condition occurred between 2014 and 2016. We take advantage of the last wave of the Malawi Demographic and Health Survey, which took place early 2016, and where for the first time information on transactional sex practices in the last 12 months were included in the questionnaire. From this data, we also get information on STI symptoms in the past year and for subsample on HIV status based on blood tests. In order to identify the areas that suffered from a drought, we use a measure of precipitation in terms of deviation from the long-term climatological average at a given location. Our main measure of interest corresponds to moderate droughts, indicating the number of months where the standardized precipitation index is inferior to a 1 standard deviation below the long-term average over a 6-month period. So on this graph, we present the number of months of droughts observed in Malawi from 2011 to 2016 in the DHS clusters. We can note a variation in drought intensity as well as a variation in drought areas, indicating that such climatic event is quasi-random. Around 10% of the sample experienced from 1 to 5 months of drought and 80% a 6-month drought at the time of the survey. We estimate on the one hand the impact of current droughts on transactional sex STI in the past year, and on the other hand the impact of past droughts on HIV status. We run estimations separately for men and women working in and outside the agricultural sector in order to test our different predictions. So let's turn to the results. Regarding the first hypothesis we have, we see that on average 6% of women declare engaging in transactional sex. Therefore, current drought more than doubles the likelihood of engaging in transactional sex for young women working in agriculture, here in green. The second hypothesis is also confirmed in the data. Current droughts double the likelihood of engaging in transactional sex for men employed this time outside agriculture. We can explore the relationship between STI symptoms and drought using the entire sample of women, and we find that current drought increases the likelihood of suffering from STI symptoms in the past year for women whose head of household work in agriculture, and this by 50%. Among men employed outside agriculture, current drought increases the likelihood of suffering from STI symptoms in the past 12 months by 75%. It takes some time for such behavioral changes to be detected in the HIV prevalence rates. We thus consider the number of 6 months drought in the last 5 years as explanatory variable for the HIV prevalence. As you can see on this table, suffering from one more drought in the past 5 years increases by 40% and 80% the likelihood of being infected with HIV for women and men respectively. So to conclude, in this paper, we explore the short and long-term effect of droughts on STI and HIV prevalence. we show that droughts are likely to increase HIV infection through an increase in transactional sex. Overall, the results suggest that economic shocks are important drivers of risky sexual behaviors among women in Africa. Therefore, the effect of formal shock coping strategies should be further studied as a mean to prevent HIV in Africa. While being the first study to explicitly measure the transactional sex channel between droughts and HIV prevalence, the data availability prevents us to implement a series of analyses which call for future research, such as comparing the sex channel with alternative risk coping strategies, such as migration or governmental safety nets. Future research could also investigate the mitigating mechanisms that could prevent women to engage in risky sexual behaviors, or the decision within the household pushing some women into this activity. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks very much, Carol, for that fascinating presentation. And over to Sandy Duboeuf to offer some reactions and comments.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I wanted to thank Aurelia and the organizers for inviting me to this session on topics that I found very interesting, and quite intellectually stimulating, but not really my area of work. So the paper I'm discussing here is an important study on an important question of both, I think, international public health matter, but also of a global social welfare. So I knew actually from things I read around that actually droughts have large and global socioeconomic impact, but I learned much more in reading the paper. And this has opened my interest to this fascinating topic on the extended impact that natural disasters can have on different outcomes. And I'm thankful for the authors because they're providing in this paper a very rich literature review. And I think it's actually very useful for a naive reader like I am. So I guess my comments are more suggestions to make the message of the paper coming through a bit clearer. And my understanding is also that this is a paper that is still in progress, and I hope that I can help with improving it. So I think the paper here studies two outcomes, and as Carol has presented quite well, it's actually not even two, I would say it's even three outcomes, because what we have is the self-reported transactional sex, both in male and in female. We have as well, the HIV positive aspects, both in male and in female, and we have STIs as well in both sex. So while I can see why the two outcomes are studied, model-wise, I think here the two of them are only linked through the incidence of droughts. And this incidence of droughts is actually used as an exogenous shock. And in your two equations, the one that you just presented, which I think could also gain a bit in clarity with the use of different alphanumerical parameters, to clarify really that we're talking about different outcomes in each equations. Anyway, about those two equations, I think there are in essence two independent regressions that translate that the paper has two independent objectives. And I really wonder here if there is a possibility to link actually the two outcomes together. Could we, for example, look into transactional sex with HIV incidence and maybe have proposing, some implications of the two equations? And I was thinking that actually with the data you have, since you're having some area level information, maybe it could be interesting to see how HIV incidence is correlated with transactional sex at the area level. I guess DHS would allow for this kind of aggregation of variables and could ensure that the two outcomes are not anymore studied in silos, but more interacted to a certain extent. I was also very puzzled because you didn't talk about this, Carol, in your presentation, but in the paper, there is this section 5.4, where you're looking more into the determinants of transactional sex. And I was thinking that actually here, this was not a very well positioned section, and maybe the position was probably coming straight after actually looking at the transactional sex as the outcome. And I really think here as well that I was puzzled with one of the hypotheses, and hypothesis 2, where you're saying that men are employed outside agriculture are increasing their consumption of transactional sex in areas that are affected by droughts. And I was really thinking there are two things here. Of course, we could think that actually it's men that are increasing their consumption, and that could be a response actually to a higher supply. But this is as well, this elasticity price of transactional sex, where actually maybe there is a reduced price increasing related actually to this kind of unprotected sex. And I think here, it looks like you're considering mainly the former, but you also mentioned very much the later. And I would be really actually interesting to see how this has two different impacts, on the model that you're having. So I would have as well some suggestions, to clarify the paper. But what I think what's really interesting is also that you were working only because of the data set on a smaller sample, but from the very beginning of the paper, I couldn't get this, and I would have loved to have this much before. But I will stop here, and I thank very much the author for this great and interesting read. I learned a lot. It's very useful, I think, to study for future policy in developing countries, both in Malawi or anywhere else, and best of luck for the rest of the paper. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Sandy. So over to the third presentation, which is by Wally To, speaking to the question of why COVID-19 may lead to an increase in HIV/AIDS in Africa. Over to you, Wally.
Sorry, have I unmuted myself?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, sorry. Thank you everyone for listening to our presentation. This is joint work with Aurelia, Carol, Sandy, Henry, Elach, Kadi, and Shek. So basically with this study, what we wanted to answer are two questions. The first one is related to this whole topic on economic shocks and risky sexual behaviors. And the question that we wanted to answer is, we know that female sex workers have been badly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. But we wanted to see, okay, has the prevalence of unprotected sex actually increased, and how much? And the second one is related to the collateral effects of COVID-19 pandemic. And the question here we wanted to answer is it possible for HIV/STI public health crisis to develop as an after effect of COVID-19 pandemic? Basically, yes, maybe we will see a decrease in condom use, but at the same time, we also know that client numbers have decreased by a lot. So it's about this relative decrease. So let me talk about a bit about the Senegal context. They saw the first case of COVID-19 in 2 March, and then they were very proactive at introducing measures. They had a national state of emergency. They introduced a night curfew, which ended around the second day of our survey. And even then, after that, entertainment venues where legal female sex workers seek for clients remain closed. And this situation basically has continued. They had the second wave of cases, and now they're having that third wave of cases again. So actually it has been quite a prolonged crisis by now. And our survey was done actually relatively early in the crisis in comparison. It was done about 3-4 months into the pandemic. So Aurelia has a female sex worker. It's kind of a panel, but there has been a lot of survey attrition, and there's also attrition from sex work. Every wave, the cohort is replenished. So we will actually be comparing data across waves. The first one was collected in 2015, and then 2017, and then in June, July 2020. And because of all these attrition and replenishment, we will actually just do a cross-sectional comparison. And we will only study active sex workers. So I've mentioned this, that we'll be doing a cross-sectional comparison. What we are the most interested in is condom use prevalence, which we will detect using a double lease experiment, because Aurelia and Carol in their previous papers have shown that condom use tends to be misreported by quite a lot. And we also look at sex work revenues and the client numbers. Also in 2020, we asked respondents to rate on a Likert scale how much COVID-19 has affected their sex work revenues and client numbers. So the reason is we know that the waves are quite far apart, and there could be time trends or something like that. So what we wanted to do is to have additional confirmation that what respondents are reporting qualitatively that it is an effect because of COVID matches up with what we see in the data itself. So regarding the first question, whether there has been a decrease in condom use prevalence and what drove it, first we saw that there is indeed a very large drop in sex work revenues. And this is also corroborated by the respondents reporting that sex work revenues have strongly decreased because of COVID. And we see that this is predominantly caused by a huge drop in the number of clients. So the mean actually dropped by 70%. And there was also quite a strong drop in condom use prevalence. In the end, we see that in 2015 and 2017, there is basically not much change in condom use prevalence, but in 2020, there is quite a significant drop. And this amounts to, in terms of unprotected sex, 60.2%. So the next question to ask is, okay, why is this? So we actually looked at a few mechanisms, but economic shock is the only one where we saw some signs that maybe it is because of the economic shock caused by COVID. Because we see among the asset poor, relatively asset poor, among the female sex workers, there has been a higher drop in condom use prevalence between 2017 and 2020. And for female sex workers who reported that they were full-time sex workers in 2017, we also saw quite a huge drop in condom use prevalence, but not so much for those who were not working full-time. So the second question we want to answer is whether an HIV/STI public health crisis could arise from a COVID-19 pandemic. To do so, we did a very, very rough and approximate back of envelope calculation. So let's say if a condom is very protective, for example, for HIV, then what would influence HIV or STI transmission risk would be more the risk from unprotected sex acts. So basically we have the total number of sex acts, which in this case, we were not very specific. So we treat it as the number of clients. And we have, this is the share of unprotected sex, and this is the risk that you get from unprotected sex. So basically, if the first line was pre-pandemic and the second line is post-pandemic, where number of clients dropped by 70% and unprotected sex increased by 60.2%, then you see that actually overall HIV/STI transmission risk has likely fallen. So is that all? Is it true that yes, that's it? Actually, we found quite worrying signs that borrowing could have been an alternative coping mechanism, because you see that the condom use prevalence is actually concentrated among people who did not have debt. And a lot of people were actually indebted. So potentially we could see further condom use declines if borrowing limits are reached, or maybe they have to repay the debt when client numbers recover. So what we recommend is to continually monitor client numbers and condom use prevalence and debt during and after the pandemic. And yeah, this study suggests that policies alleviating economic hardships could potentially reduce risky sexual behaviors. But currently, there's a lack of research in that.
Great, thanks very much, Molly. And over to Mylène Lagarde to offer some comments and reactions.
Thank you very much. So it was a very nice paper. It's one of the few, I think, papers that has taken advantage of an ongoing research project, a longitudinal study here, like the cohort of sex workers in Senegal that have been sort of followed since 2015. And what is nice is that it's a particularly vulnerable population. So that's quite a nice thing. And they have already a number of tools, a number of recruitment strategies in place. And so they build upon that to look at the impact of COVID-19 on this group. So that's really, really nice paper. So I have a number of questions / comments / suggestions. So I'm going to give you all of these in a sort of random order. So my first one is, I was wondering whether, so you have, trying to wonder, so one of the key finding to me is, this reduction in condom use, right? And so the question is the obvious, I would say the obvious, which is a little bit the story brought by the paper, which is that, well, there was a reduction in the number of clients, and therefore to maintain or to try and avoid a reduction in income, you sort of increase the price of you increase the price of the sexual acts. But I was also wondering whether it could also be a reaction to a demand problem, because on the demand side, maybe also, there was also a shock, and there was also potentially less money, and so people maybe, were wanted to pay less, and so as a way to just get to the same previous price per, I would say, protected acts, the only way to do that was to offer unprotected sex. Because I think one of the issues that we don't see in the price per act, we don't see a difference in between the waves. So I was struggling a bit to understand what was going there. And that led me to a second series of questions. So there's, and there's a history to this paper on, using the list experiment to look at condom use. But there are a number of other sensitive questions, right? So, and the price paid per act or the income earned are potentially also other sensitive questions. I mean, not just, income is a complex question, not just in this population, but in general. And so I was wondering whether because you say you insist a lot on the fact that condom use is a very sensitive question, but what about the other two? And I was wondering whether you could say that, well, we should trust the other two for which you don't have the equivalent of the list experiment. I would have wanted to see a bit more background information on whether people were allowed to move around at the time, or whether there was a shelter in orders, or I can't remember how you say that, but whether people could travel around, or whether could people go and visit someone in someone else's house, as per the lockdown rules in Senegal. And the modeling, I wasn't too convinced by the modeling, and I wonder whether it's almost like it shouldn't be almost like two separate papers. The modeling as you have it at the moment is quite crude and one of my big questions, and I'm not an epidemiologist or clinical person, but I don't think that a 50% reduction in condom use translates into a 50% increase in the risk of transmissibility. And so you sort of do, this very, very crude calculation, which I'm not entirely sure is correct. So maybe you might want to partner with medical people, epidemiologists, to look at that, to do something a bit less crude and a bit more complex on that. I don't know. I'll stop that because, like I say, I'll send you my other couple of comments if you want.
Great, thanks very much, Milen. Further food for thought. So over to the last paper, which is by Henry Cust, looking at the anticipated economic shocks from Tabaski, a religious festival, and how that affects risky sexual behavior.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so this final paper, again, I wrote with my PhD supervisors, is looking at the anticipated economic shock of Tabaski and seeing the effect on risky sexual behaviors. So what is Tabaski? Tabaski is a religious festival celebrated in West Africa, and it's the Islamic celebration of Eid al-Adha, or the Feast of the Sacrifice. And what it involves is each household sacrificing a sheep or a goat the top sheet can cost up to 1,500 euros each. But in our sample, the mean contribution was 150 euros. But this is still a significant amount of money for this, for the sex worker population in Senegal. And we do find evidence that they are feeling the economic pressure because of Tabaski. So how might sex workers respond to this economic pressure? Well, they have the lever of intensity of sex work, but on the other side of that, clients are also suffering from the economic shock, and so it might be difficult if there's a fall in demand that goes with during this time. They can increase their non-sex work income, so if they have a second job, or they can rely on their coping strategies. They can borrow, they can use their networks, their family, or sell assets. But what we're looking at in this paper is the risk premium. Again, so the premium that comes with offering unprotected sex. Are they exploiting this to earn more money to pay for the festival? So our key research question is, does Tabaski result in harmful consumption smoothing behaviors in sex workers? So the data we used is the same, or is the third wave that Wally was using in the previous talk. So it's the third wave of an observational study targeting sex workers around Tabaski. So Tabaski in 2020 took place on the 31st of July, and data collection took place in the 4 weeks before this, up to the 28th of July. We interviewed around 650 sex workers in Dakar. And importantly, these interviews were conducted in a non-systematic order. So we want to find out the effects of Tabaski on condom use. So to do this, we exploit the non-systematic order of interviews and compare sex acts that are close to Tabaski to sex acts that are further away from Tabaski. Now, there's a couple of threats to this, things that might be driving the results. Those that were new to the survey, so the replenishment mechanism, we had to recruit new sex workers. They were generally interviewed on average a little bit later in the survey periods than others. And then also those that are maybe less organized could have delayed their interview and been interviewed on average later than those that were more organized. But we don't find any evidence of this driving our results. So our outcome was collected via the list randomization. It's the same outcome as Wally previously. So what this does is allows sex workers to answer the question of whether they used a condom during their last sex act without actually revealing the answer themselves. And then it allows a prevalence estimate to be calculated by the researchers, a prevalence estimate for the sample of that behavior. Then what we do is use subgroup analysis to compare two subgroups within this sample. So for us, that's the treatment group, those sex acts close to Tabaski versus those further away. And there's previous evidence of the social desirability bias we're trying to overcome existing within this population and this behavior. So this is the model we estimated. I won't go into too much detail, but the coefficient of interest is beta 3 here, which is represents the condom use prevalence difference between our two subgroups, so our treatment and our control group. Our treatment is called TD, and it represents sex acts within a certain amount of days to Tabaski. So our main results, here each row of this figure is a separate model that was run with a different definition of TD, our treatment group. So the first one is, the treatment group is for all sex acts within 4 days of Tabaski. The next one within 5 days, 6 days, etc. So the first couple, at least the first one, the number of observations in this group is very low, which is why we have such a wide confidence interval. But between 5 and 12 days, you can see that the confidence intervals on this beta 3 coefficient become smaller, and they are all negative, and around 50%, which indicates a 50 percentage point difference between each group. Yeah, so the main results between 5 and 12 days is a reduction in condom use. So for the counterfactual group at 5 days, the condom prevalence rate is 63.8. We find a 52.2 percentage point reduction. which translates to an 81% drop in condom use within 5 days of Tabasky. Within 12 days, so the final statistically significant coefficients, this is reduced to a 37% drop in condom use for sex acts within 12 days of Tabasky. But there's negative coefficients all the way to 28 days. This is the regression output from that mirrors the graph we saw. So here, 5 days, we have a 52.2 percentage point reduction, and then day 12, it's 24.4. So we also included a model with some controls. So we included the sex worker's age, whether their interview was delayed, and if they were new to the survey. And what we find is that the results are robust between 6 and 9 days before Tabasky. To include any other controls, because they all have to be interacted within the model, there's a high risk of overfitting by adding lots of controls in there. Also, the effect size is reduced when we include these controls. So then we wanted to look at, to dig down into the results a bit more. So we did a subgroup analysis of Tabasky exposure. So we took those that were definitely celebrating Tabasky and those that were still to purchase an animal at the time of their interview as proxies for kind of exposure higher exposure compared to others. And this it was consistently lower for more exposure. There was a bigger effect of condom use reduction, which is evidence that Tabasky is the mechanism driving this. Then we also wanted to look at coping depth. So we used asset poor as a proxy for coping depth. So poor versus rich. And what we actually found was the poorer the sex worker was, the more likely they were to use a condom compared to the rich. And this wasn't exactly what we expected. And we're speculating at this point, but there's almost a protective effect of being poor. And is this because they're setting their expectations lower before the festival starts? They maybe don't have quite the same pressure as slightly richer sex workers. So one of the limitations with this is our estimates represent recent sex acts or female sex workers with more recent sex acts. And so we treat these estimates as an upper bound. There's also the limitation that we're not actually capturing overall number of condomless sex acts here. We're just capturing the propensity for a single sex worker to not use a condom. So we have to be careful with the interpretation of what this means. And then the subgroup analysis, we have to be very cautious with drawing strong conclusions because the list randomization is already a noisy method. And so we have to be careful with that. So quickly to conclude, we find that there's a big effect in the 5 to 12 days before Tabasky. That's the prevalence of condom use drops by up to 81%. Anticipating a shock, so knowing it's coming, doesn't seem to make a difference in terms of the risks that people are willing to take. And we also find that increasing exposure to Tabasky increases our effect size. There's still some concerns with endogeneity, but we don't think that these are responsible for the very dramatic findings that we get. Again, I want to thank my funders. Thank you all for coming and listening to my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry. And can I invite Antoine Nebu to offer a few reactions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Thank you very much, Henry. And thank you for inviting me discussing your paper. Like Sandy, I'm not an expert in the field. So my remark and comment might seem naive or at least genuine. First, I would like to emphasize about the unicity of this sample of female sex worker in Senegalese. Being myself an behavioral and experimental economist, I must say that it is impressive to be able to maintain such a sample and a panel over years and during a period like the one we are going through for more than 80 months now. The paper, as Henri presented it very well, was surveyed during the months prior to the Tabasky celebration and measure the condom use with their last clients of Senegalese female sex worker using a two-list method, and then employ a between subject analysis. and find an association between the reduction of condom use between 5 and 12 days before Tabaski for some of these female sex workers, suggesting maybe an impact of the short-term economic pressure due to this celebration. So I have 3 layers of comment and questions. The first one is about methodology. So again, I'm not an expert. And so in the survey, you use a two-list methodology for measuring condom use, as it is a sensitive question compared to a direct question. And what strikes me in this methodology is that you use 4 statements. One about the condom use with the last customer, which is some kind of a precise question. And the 3 other statements are more general about sexual behavior. So I wanted to ask if this method was standard and has been validated. It's quite technical and methodological question. Other type of question comments are about the measure of the timing of the questionnaire that were the months before Tabaski, but we stop, unfortunately, 3 days before the celebration. And I want to ask if there was a constraint about that, because it would be nice to see the behavior of those female sex workers even just before the celebration. Because my main question is to know if there might be other factors than economic pressure that could explain the reduction of condom use of those female sex workers. It might be due to mobility or to the celebration itself, not only to the price of this religious event. So that's on the methodological part. On the theoretical implication, you present a model in your paper. I think it's a bit scarce in terms of presentation. And I wanted to know if there was other prediction of this model that are accounted in your data, and if it could be possible to expand your model using time preferences, because obviously time preferences are the pink elephant in the room here. And so, and probably as you have measure risk attitude in your survey, you might have measure time preferences, and it would be a nice extension to see how it link in your data. And my final question would be, knowing the association between economic pressure and risky sexual behavior, what kind of public policy would you recommend to mitigate this effect? And so I'm done.
Thank you. Tim, have I got time to come back on a couple of those?
Just hold on. I want to give the audience some opportunities to ask questions, but if we don't have any questions in the audience, then you can certainly come back to that. So the floor is open to any questions from the audience. Please do raise your hand or put your question in the chat to any of the 4 presenters.
So, Tim, if nobody asks a question, actually, I have one.
Sure,
if
go
that's
ahead.
okay.
Go ahead, Sandy.
Am I allowed even if I'm a discussant?
You are, otherwise we'll be just listening to silence. So do go
brilliant.
ahead.
No, I was actually very interested in actually Milan's discussion, because I could see some similarities in mine, and I really think there is this issue here of supply and demand, in terms of sex working, and I would be really happy actually to hear from any of the presenters. But so there is this aspect of elasticity, where we're thinking that actually maybe if the price reduces, then actually you will have a higher, quantity consumed, of course. But then there is the other aspects where actually we're thinking that maybe, the number of acts, like people will be consuming more. And I'm really, really, puzzled with the two things here, where there is the aspects of supply and there is the aspects of demand. And is it really only an elasticity that we're looking at, or are we really thinking as well that, because even in the drought, I was thinking, maybe here the demand might not increase that much because people might have other things to do. And I think that was exactly the same point that Mylène was making as well. So I don't know if any of the authors wants to tell us a little bit more, I think, in terms of the assumptions that they're making here, and whether actually the two elements are looked in parallel, or whether one is actually preferred to the other, if it's really a question of the law between supply and demand, or if it's really an elasticity of the demand, the price of it.
Would any of the presenters like to react to that question?
I can react, but I think that I have no clear answer to provide. It's true that it's very difficult to really disentangle these questions. So with the cohort we have on female sex worker, indeed, we don't have any information on clients, which would be really interesting, maybe to disentangle this question. And so we need to think further how we could, what could be the hypothesis behind an elasticity of demand, or rather, yeah, we need to think of that. And I'm a bit afraid that with the data available, it's not so easy to really separate these mechanisms. I don't know if Mylène has some ideas.
Yeah, well, I think you're probably in a better place to try and further investigate the issue in Senegal compared to in Malawi, because in Malawi, you're looking at something that happened a long time ago, while in Senegal, you have this group of women, right? So you can even ask them now what has happened in the past year, and what has been probably through more qualitative interviews and in-depth interviews, to try and understand in greater detail what was the dynamic there. Because what you're observing is the outcome of the demand and supply reacting to the shock. You're not observing just the supply. There is, and you do mention that in the paper I read. I mean, there is a negotiation going on. I mean, and there's a huge literature that and you cite about it, right? That there is a negotiation, and so you don't know what are the starting position in this negotiation of the two parties. What you're observing is the result of the negotiation, and so it's quite complex, I think, to know what happened.
Yeah, if I can say something, thank you very much. I think the issue we have with the three empirical papers we are presented today, is that they look at shocks that affect both the demand and the supply. But what we are doing right now in Cameroon, so we're doing a randomized control trial that provide health insurance to sex workers and to their economic dependents. And I think with this experimental study, we'll be able to understand a bit more the mechanism, because the health shock is only affecting sex workers and is not affecting clients. So I think the only way to solve this issue empirically and to understand a bit more is to look at shocks that only affect either the demand or the supply. But in our case, we're looking at shocks affecting sex workers. And I think we could answer it. But there is a huge literature already showing that when sex workers face illness in their household, there is indeed a change in risky behaviors. So there is not much evidence on the effect of price, but clearly there seems to be an effect where it would not be surprising to see an increase in price going through the channel of risky behaviors. So thank you. But it's a problem because COVID, Tabaski, and drought, they both affect supply and demand. So I agree.
Thanks, Aurelia. So we've got just one more minute, but we can carry on for 10 minutes beyond the official end of the session. I was wondering, Kenneth, did you had put a message in the chat? I was wondering whether you wanted to say anything or ask any questions.
No, I was sending a private message to someone else, but mine was it was just a thought. My mind was wandering from Wali's presentation. I was just curious if maybe there was an opportunity to look at the direct to investigate the direct link between the perceived COVID-19 risk and if it has any direct effect on the perceived risk for HIV, or if it had any direct interaction. I was just wondering what it would be, because I say this because we had a study, an unrelated study, and many of the people were reporting that they thought HIV is not as dangerous in the face of COVID-19. So I was just wondering if it would be an interesting thing to check. Yeah, thank you.
So one of the mechanisms we did try to look at is we included some questions to basically asking people how the likelihood they think they would get COVID-19, and if so, how dangerous it is for them. And then we then separate them into a group where it's high fear of COVID-19 and a group of low fear of COVID-19. And we look at how the condom use prevalence dropped between the two groups, because we were thinking, yeah, maybe some people indeed prefer to see fewer clients in order to avoid COVID, but take on risk in terms of HIV. But we didn't see anything there, unfortunately. Yeah. So in the end, it's still the economic shock thing that we saw a bit more results.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing your experience.
Thanks, Wally. So we've come to the official end of the session, but I was going to, we can carry on for 9 minutes until I think that the session is cut off. Henry, I was wondering whether you wanted, I don't see any raised hands. Henry, whether you wanted to react to some of those questions from Antoine that we received at the end.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. So the first couple on the methodology questions. So yes, the double list experiment has been validated. I think that Aurelia and Carol have got some work, a paper talking about that. And so I use I follow their methods pretty closely in this paper. As for other factors that could be explaining the reduction in condom use, we did look at risk preferences and a few things, and obviously COVID is going to have a big impact. But COVID, as we saw in Wally's paper, affects everyone. It doesn't matter at what points they were interviewed. So we think COVID is probably just exaggerating the effects of a normal year. Then the third point was on we finished. So the survey period finished 3 days before Tabasky because it was more logistics reasons. We had to the interviewers and the sex workers. They're celebrating. They aren't able to do interviews, so that is why we finished then, which was unfortunate that we have this small gap. And another thing is the actual day of the festival isn't known until kind of 2 or 3. It might even be the day before. It can be between 2 or 3 days. It depends on the moon and the lunar calendar, which isn't confirmed until the day. As for the theoretical implications, we do look at risk preferences, and that does have an impact on condom use. And you're right, we did actually collect time preference data, so that's definitely something I'll look at next as in some of my models. And then finally on the public policy, I think very broadly, lessening the pressure that is felt. And there's a couple of places this pressure comes from. So the animal is the main one, that's the big purchase. But throughout the period, they're buying presents for each other. for their families and things like that. So if there's a way to release this pressure somehow, so either by distributing animals maybe or subsidizing them for the very poor and economically vulnerable, I think that might go a long way to helping to keep behaviors as safe as possible. Yeah, so thank you for your comments. They're really useful.
Thank you, Henri. The question is, when do you subsidize? Because here you have, it seems that the behavior changed very close to the event. And so you have a timing issue here. But I agree that subsidizing sheep or even subsidizing in general might be efficient.
Yeah, I'd probably say that the knowledge of the subsidy existing might be enough, even if it was the day before or 2 days before, if they knew they had, because an issue with the animals is they can't store them. They have to store them and sacrifice them on the day. So that is why there's this big peak in prices right before the festival, why it's such a big shock. So I think the knowledge that, that is cared for to an extent might be enough to smooth the shock.
Can I ask another question?
Yes, I'll give the last. Well, if it's a question,
if anyone else wants to, yeah. No, I was really interested in the review that actually Henri presented, because you were saying that there are some mixed results on the impact of cash transfers. And if I'm right, I think Carol and co-authors were really arguing in the paper I read that actually a solution for the droughts could be cash transfers. And so I was really thinking, like, what is this mixed results you have? And actually, does it mean that cash transfer is really the best compensation policy here, or is it actually a prevention policy? So I was just, I wanted to link again the work, and I guess, since there are some similar co-authors, there is a good understanding of this, which I don't have. Thanks.
Great question.
Yeah, so on the cash transfers, what we found is many of them, they look at a huge range of outcomes, and they will write their paper about the outcomes that they find. But when we specifically look at the sexual risk outcomes, it's not very clear cut. There's one, there's a famous cash transfer by Bairds and co-authors in 2012, I think in Malawi again, where they find it's protective against HIV and other STIs, but then replications have found that this isn't actually, the model choice is very important on those findings. And then they actually went back to that same sample a couple of years later and looked at the kind of long-term impacts, and again found that once the cash transfer was withdrawn, basically everything reverted back to normal very quickly. There was a big spike in marriages and dropouts and other risky behaviors. So I think the driving point, the conclusion on that in my review was that it's, small uplifts aren't seeing huge beneficial effects. It's the more, when we see big, more natural economic growth is where you actually see the sustained benefits.
Good. Well, I think on that note, which is it tied together the different presentations, so I appreciate that question. So I think on that note, just a huge thanks to the presenters and a huge thanks to the discussants who read in detail the longer presentations and indeed working papers. Thanks, Aurelia, for the organization. And thanks very much to the audience for coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of IHEA. Thank you very much.